Alright, so we're going to start our next chapter now, which is going to be on population ecology, first of our ecology chapters. So we're going to take a look now at different aspects of populations, how they behave, some of the ways we describe them, and some of the most important things that people study when they try to study populations. Before we get too far into the lecture, though, I want to remind everyone what a population is, right? It's a really critical part of this. Population is a group of individuals from a single species in the same place at the same time. It's one species in the same place at the same time. So if you were to look at on Lakeland's campus, right, there's a bunch of Canada geese. We could say there is a population of Canada geese on Lakeland's campus. That wouldn't include any other species except for those geese on campus. Same place, same time, single species. That's a population. So what we're going to be looking at here in this chapter are some of the aspects of the environment that might affect a population. So you might look at abiotic things, non-living things like sunlight and water and nutrient cycling. You could also look at biotic things like competition and predation and herbivory and those kinds of things. Some organisms are what we call conformers. In other words, if you look at something like a reptile, right, they're going to go with whatever temperature the environment is. That's more or less what their body temperature is going to be. Versus a regulator, which would be something like a mammal or a bird, when it comes to temperature regulation, they actually maintain a temperature that's oftentimes different from what their environment is. So some organisms sort of go with the flow, and others spend a lot of time and energy trying to maintain conditions that are different from the environment to maintain their peak efficiency. We can look at short-term versus long-term responses. We can look at short-term behavioral things or physiological ways to adjust body temperature to the environment versus longer-term things where you have evolution and natural selection in play. Short-term is physiological, long-term is natural selection and evolution. So there are different time scales at play here. We look at organisms and how they respond as well. When it comes to facing the challenges of the environment, there are different ways to do that. There are physical ways, what we call morphology or structural ways to cope with changes in the environment. There are physiological ways. These are processes like, a lot of the things we saw back in our chapters on animal systems. The physiological process of filtration in kidneys is a way to cope with changes in pH or changes in blood volume, changes in blood pressure, changes in osmolarity of the blood. It's a physiological way. It's a process-based way to maintain conditions where you want them to be inside the body. And you can also find behavioral ways. If you look at how a reptile is going to cope with a lower than normal environmental temperature. Their temperature in the environment is too low, their body temp is too low. What they're going to do is they're going to go find the warmest possible place to lay or to sit in the sun and soak up as much sunlight as possible in order to increase their body temperature. We can also look at disturbances. We can look at things like ice storms. We can look at droughts. We can look at fires or floods as ways of upsetting the balance of an ecosystem especially, but also of populations. And really, these are parts of those ecosystems. They're not separate. For a long, long time, people viewed things like fires as being anomalies or random events that were sort of unpredictable and therefore not really part of the system itself. But we know now they actually are part of the system. They're a very integral part of the ecosystem and ways to affect populations and communities as well. We can look at different types of, so here we have, in this picture over here, we have a reptilian species. We have two different habitats. We have an open habitat up top, and we have a shaded habitat down here. And if you look at animals in these two different habitats, you find a lot of variability. In the shaded area, body temperature can vary a lot from relatively low, down around 24 Celsius, all the way up to maybe 29 Celsius. If you look out in the open, it's a much more homogeneous environment. There's less variability in terms of places where these things can sit, so the temperature is going to be a lot less variable, right? So the air temperature doesn't vary as much, and because of that, body temperature doesn't vary as much either. It goes from 29 up to about 31 or so, whereas in the shaded forest, body temperature varies from 24 up to like 29 or so. If we look at wolves and polar bears in summer versus fall, one thing we see over here is that in the blue dots over here, blue dots for polar bears versus blue dots for wolves, polar bears have a much greater variability when it comes to the thickness of their fur and therefore the insulation value in the wintertime. If we look over here in the summertime, they're a lot more consistent. The thickness of the fur is a lot more predictable, a lot less variable, and for that reason it's going to insulate a more similar amount throughout the time involved. So these are environmental challenges, and these are some ways that some animals might cope with those challenges. So we defined already what a population is, right? It's a group of individuals of the same species in the same place at the same time. And so some of the things we look at with population ecology, number one is population's range. And the range is the entire geographical area over which a species exists. So if it lives in northeastern North America, that would be its range. If it lives only west of the Mississippi River, that will be its range. Geographical areas over which you find a species. We can look at the pattern of spacing. We call this dispersion, right? And so later on we'll see different types of dispersion patterns depending on what kind of organism you might be looking at. Is it uniform? Is it random? Is it clumped or aggregated? That's another thing to look at with population ecology, is how the organisms orient themselves relative to their other members of their population. And then we also look at the number of individuals. So really with population ecology, it's all about density and dispersion. How many of them are there and where are they? Those are kind of the two really big things encompassed by both range and pattern of spacing, as well as this third one down here is how many of them there are and where are they relative to each other in the environment. So we'll take a look too at population growth. We'll take a look at some life history traits. We'll take a look at something called carrying capacity. A lot of good stuff in this chapter that relates back to population ecology. These things are also variable over time, right? The environment changes all the time. That's not something that people have realized for really all that long in the grand scheme of things. The environment is not a fixed thing. If we look at 15,000 years ago or before, that was kind of the tail end of the last ice age. And so conditions then were very, very different from what they are now. Conditions then on, say, on the side of a mountain right over here, we've got different woodland species, tree species, very, very far down this mountainside. And as you move up the mountaintop, you go from woodlands to mixed conifers, which are like pines and spruces and firs and those kinds of things. And then you get more into a spruce fir forest, which is a little bit more tolerant of dry conditions and cold conditions. And then all the way at the top, you get your alpine tundra, where you stop seeing trees and you start seeing little flowers and things like that only. As time goes on, as it warms up, these species, especially these woodland species, the mixed conifers, the spruce fir, and the alpine species, as conditions get warmer after the last ice age, all these communities start migrating up the mountainside, because at the top of the mountain is where it's coldest, right? So if they like cool conditions, if they're going to continue to exist, they're going to have to move up the mountaintop to find the conditions that suit them. So these things change. If you were to go back prior to 100,000 years ago, very likely it would have looked more like this. So it would have been pre-last ice age, and conditions would have looked more like what they do now when it's a warmer period of time. So we see this happening naturally. We also see it happening as a result of human intervention, species that have their ranges restricted because of human development, species that go extinct because of human intervention. We also see species that are the opposite, species that do much better when you have humans involved. So things like coyotes and starlings and white-tailed deer and rats, they're things that do really, really well around humans, and they're going to continue to follow the humans where we go. Their populations are probably going to stay as high as they are now because they're a really good compatible species with our own species. This also depends a lot on dispersal mechanisms. Species that are able to move widely are much more able to keep up with these changes in the environment. Things that are wind dispersed, like plants that disperse their seeds through the wind, or animals that can fly, or animals that can move, walk, run over long distances. They're going to be able to disperse more widely and perhaps find conditions that are more suitable to them than species that don't tend to move around quite so much. This is a really good example of what's called a great egret, which is native to Africa. Showed up in South America for the first time, we think, in about 1937, and at the time, there was nothing else in South America that did the same thing ecologically as what an egret does. So when these birds arrived in South America, and this was not an intentional thing, there wasn't like a group of birds in Africa that just packed up and moved one day on purpose. Most likely it was a fairly severe storm that occurred that blew these animals across the ocean, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. They show up in Africa from 1937 to 1943, 51, 56. They move all the way down the western coast of South America. They move up through Central America. They move up through North America. And so by the time we get to about 1970, like look at 1970, we're in southern Canada and southern South America. They've pretty much colonized the entire north to south range of the two Americas in a relatively short period of time. They've colonized a huge range. 33 years they've colonized most of the Americas. So for a bird that's big and for a bird that can fly, it's relatively easy to do. If you're a small, relatively homebody sort of a plant, you're not going to move quite that fast. But for some animals, they can move pretty far. We know, too, that most environments are not homogeneous. They're very much different in terms of the different habitats they possess. We talk about in ecology the concept of a landscape. And a landscape is kind of like a patchwork of habitats. It's where you have, in this one little section of habitat, you've got a grassland. And if you move a few meters to the east, you find a bit of a forest. And if you move a few more meters east, you're going to find, or maybe a few hundred meters east, you're going to find a stream and some riparian habitat. And then you're going to find some urban habitat. And then you're going to find some more grassland and then some more stream habitat. So it's a very much heterogeneous patchwork type of landscape, which is really what most environments are like. But the thing to remember about that is that for most organisms, they can't live in all those different kinds of habitat patches. They're only going to be where they have their requirements met. And so that's going to create a patchwork of species too. We're going to have a spacing of individuals in a population based on the conditions. Individuals that are in the most optimal conditions typically are the more dominant ones. Individuals that are perhaps younger or weaker or older, they're going to be the ones that exist in suboptimal conditions outside the optimum places. They're going to have a really hard time eking out a living in conditions that are maybe less than optimal. So we see this kind of ongoing struggle to pick up the best habitats where possible in populations. In terms of dispersion, there are three main patterns here. We can look at a uniform dispersion, which is where you have species that are all more or less equally separated from each other by about the same distance. If you think back to the slide I showed you kind of back here toward the beginning, you have these birds sitting on these power lines. That's more or less a uniform dispersion pattern. There's just about the same distance between these birds for every space that you find. If you look at territorial species that fight with other species, if this is a really zoomed out view of the Earth, right, this dot right here might be a pack of wolves or a pride of lions, and this one right here might be the neighboring pack or pride. And when they get together, they really don't get along very well, and they fight, they drive each other away, and so forth. And so you always find kind of this minimum distance between adjacent packs of individuals. So you kind of get this relatively uniform, relatively stable distribution pattern between species. The second one is an aggregated pattern where you've got clumps of individuals. And so one thing too, if you zoom in, if you imagine this is like a zoomed out view of the Earth and each one of these is a pack of wolves, if you zoom in on just like a small area of it, well now this might be each pack. So we have a group of 4 wolves here and a group of 3 there and a group of 5 up here and 4 and 3 and so on. They're actually clumped together when you look at a fine enough scale in the environment. You could also look at things that exist for protection in groups. So schools of fish or flocks of birds or herds of deer, they're all going to be in groups to help protect themselves. They're aggregated that way. Even plants tend to be aggregated because conditions or resources in the environment don't tend to be dispersed evenly or randomly. They tend to be more or less clumped together. So wherever you find a good patch of resources for some species, you're going to find a bunch of individuals of the species hanging out there. Up here, we've got another big patch of good nutrients for a species. You're going to find a bunch of individuals hanging out there as well. So aggregated actually is the most common type of the three because resources, especially in the environment, also tend to be clumped in this sort of a manner. The third type over here is random dispersion or distribution, where there really is no rhyme or reason as to where they exist. And that one really is the least common of the three types, because chances are if you've got a species that's dispersed somehow in the environment, there's going to be a reason. They're not just dispersing randomly. There's going to be a reason for them being where they are, and that typically, if you look close enough, is going to end up being one of these other two patterns of distribution. We also talk about in population ecology a lot the concept of a metapopulation. So I'm going to give you guys my definition of a metapopulation, which is going to sound kind of funny at first, but it actually kind of sort of makes sense. A metapopulation is a population of populations. Right? It sounds kind of funny, but I'll explain more here in a second. It's a bunch of smaller populations that collectively together make up one bigger overall population. So these subpopulations tend to be relatively patchily distributed in the environment. They're dispersed throughout different aspects of the environment. There are some subpopulations which are what we call sources. Those tend to be the ones that have the really good conditions. They can produce excess individuals which disperse out and perhaps colonize the less good habitats. You can also have sink subpopulations. These are populations that live in the poorer habitats, the suboptimal habitats, where they're not going to do as well, and so they need to be replaced by the sources. So we have these different habitats, and we have migration among the different subpopulations. So if, for example, up here we've got an occupied habitat patch, this one might send out colonists down here, and this one might send down colonists to here, and this one all of a sudden would turn blue. It would be an occupied habitat patch because there's always movement back and forth among these different subpopulations within the overall population itself. This entire thing is the population. Each one of these dots represents a subpopulation where there are conditions there that could support this particular species. Oftentimes, there will be local extinctions. You might see, as in this picture, there are these red dots, places where they are currently unoccupied. At one point in time, they probably were occupied by the species, but for whatever reason, that species went extinct locally. It's not there anymore. But it could be recolonized by one of the blue patches. And so by having this connectedness and by having this ability to have source populations, rescuing sink populations, and movement back and forth, and gene flow back and forth, there is the ability for the overall population to remain viable and not go extinct, as long as you have some connectedness. Now, if you start separating these subpopulations from each other, if you start separating these little dots from each other such that the species can no longer move back and forth, well then if one of these goes extinct, it might not be rescued. If it's not connected to a source population, it might stay extinct. And if that happens enough times over a long enough period of time, you might actually risk extinction of the entire species, or the entire overall population at least, if there's not this ability to recolonize these other habitats. So we're going to cut off here, and I will pick up with another section here in just a moment.